Welcome to the Beau Show, the home of faith, family, and freedom. I would like for today's show to be upbeat and happy-go-lucky, but it can't be, because I think a lot of us are quite appalled that Joe Biden has traded a Russian arms dealer for a WNBA player. Most of you were likely aware that Brittany Griner, a WNBA basketball player, was detained and jailed in Russia for possessing the liquid oil form of marijuana while trying to travel. Griner is a center for the Phoenix Mercury. Her luggage contained hash oil, which carries a stiff penalty. She said that she didn't mean to bring the oil with her when she traveled to Russia to play in an off-season league, but pleaded guilty to the crime. She had a trial and was sentenced to 9 years in prison following her arrest. Joe Biden said, quote, "After months of being unjustly detained in Russia, held under intolerable circumstances, Brittany will soon be back in the arms of her loved ones, and she should have been there all along. This is a day we've worked toward for a long time. We never stopped pushing for her release," unquote. This is the second prisoner swap between Moscow and the White House. In April, the U.S. traded Konstantin Yeroshenko, a Russian smuggler of cocaine, for Trevor Reed, a former Marine who had been in Russian prison for almost 3 years. The Griner deal was in the works for over a week, but they kept it quiet because they knew that if it was made public, Russia might pull out of the deal. Why? Well, my guess is because the American public knows what a horrible trade this is, and uproar would ensue. Let us not forget that in 2014, Barack Obama traded 5 Taliban soldiers from Guantanamo Bay for Army deserter Sergeant Beau Obama and, of course, sidekick Joe Biden gave back 5 Taliban soldiers for an American deserter. At the time, Senators Lindsey Graham and John McCain noted that this set a horrible, horrible precedent for how we negotiate. In fact, the Obama administration didn't give Congress the required 30-day notice required of negotiations. Now, as we fast forward, think about what happened in Afghanistan as Joe Biden withdrew our military. 13 Marines died as a result of this poor leadership. And it's quite possible that those same 5 Taliban soldiers were back doing what they did before in aiding the Taliban kill these Americans. So recall that it was Barack Obama and VP Joe Biden who started this process of negotiating with terrorists and establishing a terrible precedent. That is all necessary as a backdrop leading up to this Brittany Griner trade with Russia. During Griner's 2020 WNBA season, she stated in an interview that she does not believe the Star-Spangled Banner should be played at basketball games. And she remained in the locker room until after the song had finished. Griner added, quote, "I don't mean that in any disrespect to our country. My dad was in Vietnam and a law officer for 30 years. I wanted to be a cop before basketball. I do have pride for my country," unquote. Now that's interesting because she has a father who served this country twice, but yet she feels the need to protest. Her teammate, Brianna Turner, echoed Griner's feelings, saying, quote, "It's not played at Walmart. It's not played when you go to Six Flags. Why is it played before sporting events?" unquote. See, this is where the heart of the matter is when it comes to hating America. Privileged athletes don't understand why the anthem is played at sports events. The reason, my friends, is to unite people, not just behind the sport itself, but the freedom the country affords to be able to play that sport. This goes all the way back to the nation's pastime of baseball. There have been pauses in our national sports due to world wars that we were involved in. We did the same thing after 9/11. The reason we sing is to honor the country for the ability to play the sport, to watch the sport, and not be jailed for 9 years for a petty crime. That's what authoritarian regimes do. So if you can't honor that for 90 seconds, and just so you know, since I've sung this many, many times before, most pro sports teams require the anthem to be sung in 90 seconds. If you can't stand for that, then you're forgetting the soil you're on. That is why it rubs people the wrong way. So when Griner says things like this and then spends 10 months in Russian prison, some are going to be unsympathetic to her cause, because now she's getting a taste of how other countries do things. If she tried that protesting crap in Russia, well, she wouldn't get too far. So now let's talk about this totally lopsided trade. Griner was exchanged for notorious arms dealer Viktor Bout. And it's important to know who he is, because the media is going to downplay this. They don't care who he is or what he did. They just care that Griner is back on U.S. soil. Bout was held in a federal prison in Marion, Illinois. He was arrested by the DEA in Thailand back in 2008. He was convicted for conspiring to kill Americans and to serve a 25-year sentence. Let me repeat that. A 25-year sentence for conspiring to kill Americans. Bout was the notorious inspiration for the 2005 Nicolas Cage film, Lord of War. Tom Pasquarello was the DEA agent who helped put Bout behind bars and was aghast at the trade. He said that the U.S. State Department has a responsibility to figure out how to get wrongfully detained Americans back home without a prisoner swap. He told Yahoo News, quote, "I'm kind of in disbelief that someone with the potential to orchestrate arms deals that can kill Americans anywhere in the world would be traded for a prisoner. I think this sends a terrible message that the U.S. will negotiate and that the U.S. will make concessions, and that if an American is held overseas, there's always the potential that the U.S. will acquiesce to the demands of people like Russian President Vladimir Putin and bail them out," unquote. Bout smuggled military-grade weapons to rogue leaders and insurgent groups across Africa and beyond, elevating conflicts from machetes and one-shot rifles to grenade launchers and AK-47s. Griner had cannabis oil. Does that sound like a good trade to you? The notion of releasing someone like Bout for anyone is almost incomprehensible unless you're Joe Biden. Yuval Weber, an expert on Russian military and political strategy and a distinguished fellow at Marine Corps University's Brut Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, told Yahoo Sports that Bout's release may, quote, incentivize rogue state and non-state actors to kidnap or imprison on trumped-up charges more Americans, unquote. Weber also expressed concern that Bout might reprise his former role as an operative who exported arms to Russian allies at the Kremlin's bidding. Weber was quoted as saying, quote, "In sports terms, we just traded a GOAT, first ballot Hall of Famer who still has many years of productivity left, for a hometown Division III star." Let's watch on Russian state TV how this trade looked. What I see are some men shaking hands, and it's not clear if Bout and Griner shook hands, but this is not what we should be seeing. Even NBA players that get traded don't shake hands with their opposing team reps. What we are seeing is the exchange of a mass weapons supplier who may likely go back to his bad deeds for a WNBA player. It just doesn't pass the smell test. And no sports analyst would ever think this trade is good. While Griner's offense was paltry, Bout's crimes were enormous and lethal. Bout has been described by Russia as a businessman and an entrepreneur. In the 1990s, as the USSR collapsed, equipment and ammunition were everywhere. So he started a cargo transport business that could move everything from flowers to large-scale weaponry and tanks. Where do you think he made his money? The ability to supply that sort of firepower rapidly and with pinpoint accuracy helped Bout build a client list that included some of the world's most notorious leaders. He made $50 million supplying the Taliban with military equipment, according to the U.S. Department of Treasury. He also allegedly inflamed conflicts in Liberia, Congo, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Sudan. Angola was one country where Bout allegedly defied United Nations sanctions prohibiting arms trafficking and U.S. peacemaking efforts. A former high-ranking U.S. State Department official told Yahoo Sports in May that in the mid to late 1990s, Bout sold Soviet-era arms to both sides of the Angolan Civil War, the Marxist government and the UNITA rebels seeking to overthrow it. Yahoo Sports says that Bout consistently stayed one step ahead of international investigators by repeatedly registering and re-registering his planes in far-flung countries, enabling him to avoid inspections and oversight. It also helped that Bout had the protection of the Russian government, enabling him to retreat to Moscow after global law enforcement agencies shined a spotlight on the work he had long been doing in the shadows. When the DEA and Pasquarello finally baited him by posing as Colombian rebels, they had him pinned against a wall, and they asked Bout, "Do you have anything to say?" Bout replied, "The game's over." This man was a clear danger to the world, and specifically America. Bout got out 6 years early. Now, you may remember that in previous shows I told you how George Soros-funded district attorneys have helped to cut various criminal sentences short, releasing them back into the public early. This happened with both Cleotha Abston, who murdered Eliza Fletcher in Memphis, as well as Ezekiel Kelly, who went on a lethal shooting spree in Memphis. When I raised this issue of why this was happening, the conclusion I drew was that district attorneys cut deals that allow violent criminals an early release. So what Biden did is release Viktor Bout 6 years early, when he still has plenty of killing left in him. This is not a 103-year-old feeble man who wants to just die in peace. It was reported that Anthony Blinken had made the proposal to trade Bout for both Griner and Marine Paul Whelan, but the Kremlin rejected that proposal. And so the Biden administration went for Griner only. Experts say that securing Bout's release was a proud moment for Putin because Bout is a former intelligence agent who displayed loyalty to Russia. Bout operated with state protection throughout his arms trafficking career and often served the government's foreign policy interests once Putin rose to power.